The 2022 election's finally over. There's still a few outstanding items, but let me tell you, I've got a few takeaways. And the first one, and I think the most important, is that people were more afraid of freedom, actually for responsibility for freedom, than they were for tyranny. So let's take a quick look at kind of the overall and maybe talk about what conclusions we can reach so we can go forward in a positive way and find some excitement coming up for the next while here. So let's get started. First off, we can take a look at the map here. We've got a whole lot of red. In fact, one of my takeaways is red places got a whole lot redder. So if you're already in a red state, you are in an even redder state now. Florida, I believe, took all statewide offices, and they're all Republican now. Missouri, I believe, for the first time in a couple of decades, same thing. The all the statewide offices are filled with Republicans as of this election. Blue places, on the other hand, were a lot tighter than they should have been. In fact, surprisingly close in many cases. And this is where things get interesting and we start looking at what's really happening here. Let's take a look at New York just real fast. We'll go over to the governor's election right here. Kathy Hochul managed to pull out a win by only 5 percentage points. Now, you all probably think of 5 percentage points as being a pretty big loss, except for you got to remember that's in deep blue New York. Now, New York does have a whole lot of rural area that is solidly Republican territory. But Lee Zeldin actually pulled off what should have been, what for the Democrats should have been an easy win, but he got it really close. He made it competitive. And if we're competitive in New York, which has lost a ton of Republicans to places like Florida and Texas, what's really going on in the Empire State? Yeah, there's a lot of things to unpack in that, and I don't know that I can. Conversely, we look at Nevada, my home state, my original home state, I should say, and they've got a Republican governor again. It's been a while for that as well. In fact, Nevada's been a reliably blue state for quite some time. But in this case, a Republican actually displaced a Democrat governor, an incumbent Democrat governor, by just a little over 1%, I think about 1.5% percentage points. That's pretty impressive, especially with all the headwinds there. The politics in Nevada are definitely trend more Democrat than they do Republican, especially with Southern Nevada in play. But he still pulled off a win. That's pretty impressive. Then again, we've got the governor's race in Arizona with Lake and Hobbs. Hobbs didn't really run. She didn't even bother to debate Lake. And there was a lot of down ballot material there where the down ballot races were strongly Republican. In fact, a lot of flips there and a lot of positive momentum. And yet it didn't carry over to that governor's race for some reason. I'm not going to jump into the conspiracy theories, but I am going to point out that Hobbs, who's the Secretary of State at this point in time, also supervised her own election. So there's some serious concerns about that. And I believe that, as I understand it, they're going to be challenging that. But you're looking at situations here that should not have been close, and yet they were. And some of them flipped, like Nevada. Some of them didn't flip, like New York. And really, that tells me a lot. In fact, what it tells me is that the blue places got a little less blue, and the purple places went a little bit more red. Not enough to really turn over the results, but enough that there's an awful lot of people that were skin of their teeth close to winning in places where they didn't used to have a chance. That said, I think red states have really come to be more concerned at this point in time with local and state representation. This is where the blue people, the Democrats, were really strong for some time, really effectively chasing down those state offices when they were looking at it from the perspective of, if you control the states, you can control the union. Whereas the red states, that's kind of how they're realizing it. By the Constitution, the states have power in a lot of places that the federal government should not. But as that has shifted through various questionably constitutional actions where the federal government has taken on a lot more responsibility than is spelled out in the Constitution, they've been going after those federal races something else. Now, that tells me that they're looking at the nation as a whole and they're hoping to drive the narrative on a national level and then force it down, top down, almost Soviet style command and control. Let's also look at one other thing. Places where that retained a legacy style of voting, such as, minimal mail-in ballots, no universal mail-in ballots, polling day being the preferred time to submit your ballot to actually vote, and that type of legacy style of campaigning and therefore voting, where there was no ballot harvesting or anything like that, those went red, with only the exceptions of if they did the same thing in an already reliably blue state, those stayed blue. Places that were still utilizing voting measures that were taken during COVID, however, places that have the universal mail-in ballot and additional, ballot harvesting measures that have been allowed in that time frame, they went pretty darn blue, and significantly so. That tells me that a couple of things. Number one, it tells me the Republicans are not playing the game under the rewritten rules. You could make the case that those rules should be illegal, they should not be available, they should not be there at all. And yet if they passed a legislature and they're part of that state's laws, the Republicans need to be taking advantage of it. They need to be getting out there and harvesting those ballots and doing all those things. Otherwise, they're not playing to win. That doesn't make those measures right. But if they're legal, we should be doing them, or getting laws passed to get those measures removed. And while I am much more preferable to getting rid of those laws, you got to work with the electorate you have, not the electorate you wish to have. In a lot of ways, another thing that popped up is party mattered more. Party mattered more than pretty much any other aspect in this election. In fact, capability or actually being above ground alive didn't matter as much as the party did. For instance, in Pennsylvania, they elected a state-level House representative. He died about a month and a half before the election. Now, that's not anything against Representative DeLuca. He may have done very well for his constituents. And they do say in the article that it was just too late to reprint the ballots. But they elected somebody who was dead. That's really putting the party over the politics. On top of that, you have Fetterman, for instance. Fetterman had a stroke sometime in about, I believe it was May. He is still not recovered. He still has issues with processing auditory stimuli and troubles with forming coherent sentences. And yet he was elected. In fact, it looks like his wife is going to be the one actually filling that role effectively. And so expect to see some movement there where they, once he gets sworn in, spend a month or so in office, they'll quietly state that he is no longer fit to serve and his wife will take over, or maybe he'll get better. I don't know. But that's just one of those things to keep an eye on, where it shows that party mattered more than ability. Quality of the candidates played an enormous role as well. In that same Fetterman race, we had Dr. Oz, Mehmet Oz, and he is not a good candidate for office. I don't care who endorses him. The only reason people were voting for him is because he was not a Democrat. Once again, party mattered. But he did not demonstrate the things that really showed what a good candidate was in this election cycle. Specifically, Republicans with a coherent and principled platform actually did extremely well in this race. For instance, you have Governor DeSantis. Principled positions, they kept the legacy style of voting. Everything was about the the standard way of doing things. Plus, he'd shown a tremendous amount of capability and had stuck with a set of principles that were reflected in how he governed. He took Miami-Dade County in Florida. Miami-Dade's been so blue, you could paint it the same color as the ocean and the sky, and you still wouldn't get any red out of it because it's that Democrat. And yet he brought in Miami-Dade County to really put in a blowout victory. But again, compare him to his opposition. Christ was wishy-washy. He blew with whatever direction the wind went. And so he was a tremendously bad candidate compared to DeSantis, who was a tremendously principled and effective candidate. Even Democrats that particularly expressed a real coherent principled platform tended to do pretty well. They're just few and far between. Another thing about Democrats, they ran on fear. So if you really look at it, very rarely did they actually give a principled position. Uh, they ran more on fear of the Republican boogeyman. The boogeyman was going to take away your everything, your rights. They were going to make everything worse because Democrats have to fix everything the Republicans ever do. And that played very well to the Democrat base. But more importantly, it played really well to young voters who, by and large, don't have a set of principles beyond Republicans bad. They're taught that in their college courses. They're taught that in a lot of ways. And those young voters, they turned out in droves hoping for student loan forgiveness. The very same student loan forgiveness that hit the courts and was shot down hard just 2 days after the election. This is not, when you promise free stuff, you're going to get the young voters out. Whereas the young voters that have principled positions that are after that are after good governance, those are the ones that are your future leaders. They're not the ones that are just going to turn out for a pizza and hand their ballot off to a harvester. Also, these young voters tended to be pretty big in the mail-in ballots area. That's probably the results of ballot harvesters and a get out the vote effort that basically meant that mom showed up and said, "Okay, guys, we're going out for pizza. Let's go and let's go fill out your ballots. We'll mail them in." So what you end up with is a low information voter, one who has no real knowledge of the election, of the people, of the candidates, or of the issues, who's filling out a ballot because it's in front of them. And an uninformed electorate is the worst thing you could have for a constitutional republic like the United States, because we have to be able to vote on intelligent and principled stances. I do stand by my statement that I made in a previous video that the Democrats could have been cruising to super majorities, not just wins, but super majorities, if they had just focused on the kitchen table issues. If they had not canned the domestic oil production industry so hard, if they had not gone all in on a green agenda that destroys livelihoods and destroys lives and causes the tremendous amount of inflation that we're experiencing now, if they'd gone all in on kitchen table issues instead of a revenge-based platform where they don't care what positions people have as long as they're just in here there to get revenge on their enemies. And that's really what they have been doing for 2 years. They've been going after everything that they have determined is not in their liking, and they're pursuing it as though it is an evil enemy army. And that's where it really comes down to it. If they had focused on those kitchen table issues, they'd be sitting at supermajorities and we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Instead, they've focused on revenge and taking their anger out on anybody who didn't think like them. In the end, we come back to my conclusion. People were more afraid of freedom and responsibility and responsibility for that freedom than they were of the tyranny of being told what to do and when to do it and how to do it. And people who are afraid, they don't want change because the familiar trumps the chance for positive change. Remember, a lot of times change happens, things get worse. But right now you have something that's familiar. You know where you stand. And once that changes, people don't like that anymore. So the familiar trumps that chance for change, and they don't want that. At least that's the view as it is from my front porch. Sincerely, Brian.